Thank you very much, Christine. As you were going through that introduction, I was thinking, why don't we just replace tonight's program? Instead of Larry Summers giving a lecture, we could have Christine Wallach giving a 1-hour discussion of Larry Summers. I was really quite enjoying that. It brought to mind the story about Lyndon Johnson, who was once introduced very generously and said, "I wish my parents had been here for that. My father would have appreciated it, and my mother would have believed it." It is an immense privilege to return to the American Academy. I remember attending the initial inauguration conference for the American Academy at the instigation of my good friend, Richard Holbrooke. He brought the energy to the formation of the American Academy that he brought to everything. If you'll indulge me in just one story, 6 or 8 weeks before Richard's untimely death, my wife Lisa, who's here with us tonight, and her 15-year-old daughter were with me in the lobby of the West Wing of the White House. And we ran into Richard, and my stepdaughter had just read The Kite Runner and was very interested in Afghanistan. And so I said, "Maya, this is Mr. Holbrooke. Mr. Holbrooke is coordinating Afghanistan policy. Richard, Maya is very interested in Afghanistan." And with precisely the same intensity with which he addressed presidents of the United States, secretaries of state, and secretary of the Treasury, Richard said, "Maya, what you do at your school with respect to Afghanistan is absolutely essential. The future of America depends on the vision that young people bring of this particular problem." Well, he brought that same energy to getting me here then, and it was an instructive day or two for me. And I have followed the Academy ever since. It is a very, very important institution because of what it itself does, and because of Germany's centrality to today's world. Germany's centrality as the largest and most influential nation in Europe. Germany's now 70-year story of evolution from moments of unimaginable darkness to an entirely transformed state and community in the world. What has happened in Germany over the last 70 years is in so many ways a template for what needs to happen in so many other parts of the world, that I believe the relationship between the United States and Germany is of profound importance for our future and for the world's future. And I might just say that I'm particularly glad to come within Germany to Berlin. I am struck that Berlin, probably as much as any other place, encapsulates what I think is one of the great stories in the history of my country, the way in which we prevailed in the Cold War. The Berlin airlift in 1948 stood for our fortitude and determination to resist communism, the excruciating moral decisions that went on when a potential nuclear war was defused with the building of the wall in 1961, the patient application of moral force exemplified by President Kennedy and a generation later, President Reagan's remarks not far from the wall, and the ultimate triumph with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 without a shot being fired is one of the great stories of diplomacy and perseverance in world history. So I am very, very glad to have the chance to be here tonight. These are, at one level, remarkable times for all of us to be alive, and particularly for all of us concerned with economics and with economies to be alive. If you think about it, the device I have in my pocket, and you all have similar devices in your pocket, this has more computing power by a very substantial margin than the entire Apollo program did. If you had your choice between getting information from this device and getting information from having free and full access to the Harvard libraries, which are one of the world's great library systems. I'm sorry to say it to my wife, who's an English professor at Harvard, but I'd rather have my device. The information, there's almost as much information, and it's much, much better organized and much more accessible on this device. And if you wanted to be able to communicate around the world, and you had your choice between this device and the White House communication system as it stood when John Kennedy was president, you would choose this device. And so we live in a moment of extraordinary technological potential. It says something that a child born in a developing country a decade from now will have about the same probability of dying before the age of 5 as a child born in the United States at the time when I was born. I could go on and say more about the remarkable capacities that are potentially transforming economies coming from technology. To tell just one more story, there were professors at MIT, pretty sophisticated institution, who wrote a book about technology and jobs and what computers could do and what people could do and all of that in 2004. And they had a really good example, they thought, of a task that really it took humans to do. Making a left turn in the face of ongoing traffic. 7 years later, Google had done it. And self-driving cars had no difficulty performing that task. So we live at a moment of huge technological potential to make prosperity, to make opportunity, to make things better, and to enable people to live far better lives than they ever have before. And yet, this is a moment of extraordinary frustration. Official statistics, which may of course be flawed, suggest that median incomes in the United States have risen only very, very slowly for a generation or more. In Europe, there are more people without work than at any time in recent memory. And financial crisis is importantly a defining narrative of our time. If you think about it, the 1920s, with the spread of the automobile and the spread of electrification, were a moment of extraordinary technological progress too. But when finance didn't work out, when money was not well managed, what followed was catastrophic, not just economically, but politically. And so I believe that the question of proper and well-functioning economic and financial arrangements is one that is of profound importance. And it's in that spirit that as an American, I want to reflect on views about the evolution and, of course, also the prospects for the European Monetary Union project for the Euro area. Go back to the beginning. The formation of first an iron and steel community, then a common market, then a broader European community, has to rank as one of history's great stories. At the cosmic level, nations where war every couple of generations was an accepted part of life for 1,000 years, became within a generation nations between whom war was inconceivable. To remark on a much smaller prosaic thing, Lisa and I were struck 2 days ago as we flew from Lisbon to Dresden, where I was going to have the privilege of meeting the G7 ministers, that at no point on that juncture were we asked to display a passport. And if you think about it, you all take that really completely for granted. But if you think about it, in a world of nations, in a world of competing interests, the idea that you flow across international borders with nobody asking really does represent an enormous achievement. If you think about, people use the word all the time, and we'll use it a little later here, structural reform. It's important to have structural reform to open things up, make markets more competitive, and all of that. Let's recognize that the largest, most important structural reform there ever will be in Europe has already happened with the formation of a common economic area, and it represents a huge achievement. What was the American view of all of this? The American view should have been, and I think almost always was, that this was a fantastic thing, that the knitting together of European nations had been our objective since at least George Marshall's famous commencement address at Harvard favoring the Marshall Plan, that we had learned the basic truth about economics, that it is the opposite of a zero-sum game, and that a more prosperous and successful Europe would be a better, more effective trading partner for the United States. And so the United States was almost without exception a strong supporter of the common market project, of the objective of European economic integration. Now, in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, the idea of European monetary union took off. There were multiple motivations, and people in this room probably know them better than I. As I came to understand them as a Treasury official, there was one part, an idea that a unified and enlarged Germany needed to be better cemented into a larger European Union. There were economic aspects. How could it really work to have a common market, to have a borderless system, and to have currencies fluctuating 5% or 10% when people could move across those borders readily? And there was the symbolism that a common currency would be an important part of a common European identity. Some combination of these reasons, and probably others, drove the project forward. You will note that I left out the advice of economic experts on currencies in describing what drove the project forward. As the late Mike Musa, who was for a long time the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, once remarked, one of the great regularities of monetary economics is one country, one money. Not one country, two monies, and not many countries, one money. And there was, I think it is fair to say, among professional economists, a very substantial degree of concern about the European Monetary Union project. The concerns fell, I think, primarily in three areas. The first, and the one that was most discussed and to a substantial extent has been borne out, came out of what economists call optimal currency area theory. There's a lot of math in it, but the essential idea was that there are two ways that things can work out. One way is the way they work out between Massachusetts and Texas. That Massachusetts and Texas share a common currency, that sometimes good things happen in Texas and bad things happen in Massachusetts, or vice versa. But there are important mechanisms that cushion the shocks. When the oil price goes up, lots of people move to Texas. When the oil price goes down, lots of people move from Texas. Even before people move, the United States has a federal income tax and a federal unemployment insurance. So when Texas gets $1 richer, 30 cents of that goes to the federal government. When Massachusetts gets $1 poorer, Massachusetts gets an extra 30 cents from the federal government. And so the combination of migration and taxation leads to a cushioning of shocks. That's one way it can work. A second way it can work is that way it works between Detroit and Toronto. Nobody much moves across the border ultimately between the United States and Canada. There are no appreciable financial transfers between the United States and Canada. But when great things happen in Canada, the Canadian dollar goes up, and that makes Canadian products more expensive in the United States and makes U.S. products in Canada cheaper, and that moves demand to the United States. And when bad things happen in Canada, the Canadian dollar goes down. And so a fluctuating exchange rate operates to cause the cushioning that otherwise would have happened with migration and taxation. Now, if you think about a European monetary area, there was the concern that it would be highly brittle, that you had none of this going, that there could be no exchange rate fluctuations, that's the idea of a common currency, that there was in fact very little migration, and that there was in fact very little fiscal transferring as well. So we started with the concern that it would be a very brittle system. There was a second concern, and it was probably more the concern of people here, which I would call the common pool problem. Let's imagine that we had the following idea, that we took let's say it's 120 people in this room, and we formed a dinner club. And we all were going to go out to dinner each night. And the rules were that the first night we said everybody had to pay for their own. But it was really awfully complicated, and the restaurant really didn't want to give us 120 checks. And so the second night we had a good idea, which is we said everybody paid 120th of the bill. Well, what happened? Well, maybe nothing happened the second night, but this is a group of pretty intelligent people. And so by the third night, we started eating less chicken and more beef. And we started drinking better and better wine. And then suppose somebody had an idea, which was, we really want to be social here. So we each have we each pay 1/120th of the bill, but now we can each invite guests if we want. We can invite as many guests as we want. Well, we'd all start inviting a lot of guests, and pretty soon somebody'd get the idea, well, maybe I'll charge guests to come. And I can invite 100 guests, and I'll only pay them 1/120th of the cost, and it'll really be very good. And so after a while, the whole city of Berlin will be coming to this dinner. And so if you don't get incentives right, you can run into a real problem. Well, now suppose we say that everybody can borrow as much money as they want in this common currency, and the reputation of this common currency depends on nobody ever defaulting in this common currency. And so really it's going to look and feel like all the debt is backed by all the parties. Well, then you're going to get a lot of financial irresponsibility. And that was a second major concern in the design of the euro area. There was a third major concern, which I think one can reasonably argue actually proved to be the most important. But it was the one that was least present at the time. And that was, what did you do about a banking system without its own central bank? Suppose there's a run on the Chase Bank. If there's a run on the Chase Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve creates money and lends it to the Chase Bank, assuming the Chase Bank is ultimately good. And so since everybody knows that the Federal Reserve will be able to do that, nobody really worries about getting their money out of the Chase Bank. And so by virtue of everybody knowing that you're there, you don't have to actually lend money very often. But on the other hand, what happened in the United States was that we used to have state banking systems. The state of Ohio had one, the state of Maryland had one, and they were state chartered banking systems. States stood behind them. Only one thing, states didn't have central banks. States didn't have the capacity to print money. Those banks didn't have the right to get access to the Fed automatically. And guess what? We don't have any state banking systems anymore because it didn't work. Those banks found themselves not able to consistently fund themselves and ultimately, in one way or another, failed or were merged into other banking systems. And so the question arose, what was the nature of the banking arrangements and what access did state banking systems have to the federal, or to the ECB or to central authorities? I will never forget a meeting of the OECD in about 1997 or 1998, a couple of years before the euro came into being, where it was a meeting where deputy financial officials discussed economic and financial issues, and these were not always the most exciting meetings, as you can imagine. But there was a so-called informal lunch where there wouldn't be a formal agenda. And I, in part, I'd say my motives, if I'm completely honest, were 30% to entertain myself, 30% to get information, 30% to entertain myself by having a more interesting than average conversation, and 40% just to make a little trouble. I sort of raised my hand and I said, could you guys from Europe explain something to me? Just kind of explain something to me. I don't really quite get it. Suppose the biggest bank in Spain is near failure. Like, who's in charge? Like, are people in Madrid supposed to fix it? Is the ECB supposed to fix it? Are people in Brussels supposed to fix it? Like, what's the plan? What ensued was chaos. What ensued was they all had like a fierce argument with each other, where they all had the same view, which is they had authority to spend somebody else's money. That was the common common view of all officials present. And at a certain point, after chaos went on for half an hour, one of the older Europeans sort of figured out that you're really not supposed to have your family fights when the neighbors are visiting, and brought the conversation to a conclusion. But I never forgot the experience, and it's not without relevance for what is to come. So I think it's fair to say that economists tended to feel, as I did, that this was a visionary step, but that there were a lot of questions about the basic design. And I remember remarking that governments did not build nuclear reactors when nuclear engineers told them that on that site the nuclear reactor might have a blow-up, but that economists did not command the same prestige that nuclear engineers did. And so there was a willingness to go ahead with this project. Now, I should say that the question often arose in those years, what was the American view of this project? And I just gave you some sense of what the view of at least one, and I don't think it was an atypical view, senior official at the Treasury was. But we understood that we were not there primarily in the role of professional economists, and with a certain amount of tutelage in the ways of diplomacy from John Kornblum and others, we adopted the position that whatever monetary arrangement works best for Europe is the one we want Europe to have, because a successful, flourishing Europe is very much in the United States' interest. And it is not our place to immerse ourselves in the details of Europe's monetary integration, but we very much want to see a flourishing and successful Europe, which had a kind of positive feel to it without ever quite expressing optimism about the details of this design. There was a fear, and there was a view in Europe that we were afraid that somehow the euro would displace the dollar, that somehow the euro would be a threat to the dollar. That was, at least to my mind, never a serious concern. We thought that there'd be plenty of people who'd want to hold dollars as long as the dollar stayed strong. We were more worried, for the reasons I just explained, about a weak euro than we were about a strong euro. And our view was that if there was some diversification out of the dollar, that would actually be okay. What happened? The euro was introduced. The introduction of the euro, I think it is fair to say, went smoothly. There was a certain amount of drama, but I would say, while it seemed very important at the time, in retrospect, it seems of essentially no significance, in which the euro, about a year after its introduction, fell quite sharply in value and was at one point below 90 cents to the dollar, and really looked extraordinarily weak relative to any level that the German mark had ever had. And that was a source of a lot of excitement at G7 meetings. And eventually there were some currency interventions directed at sending a signal. Those currency interventions may or may not have been efficacious, but time passed. It became clear that this was a functioning system, and the euro came to fluctuate to normal levels. It was a period, the first decade of the euro looked like a very substantial success. If you were in the periphery of Europe, it was like a fantastic thing. Credible at last. Suddenly, there was a sense that people were really excited to lend you money if you bordered on the Mediterranean, which was not a sense that there had ever been before. And they were lent large amounts of money, and they used it, they grew, they invested, they built houses, they built many different things. It was a fantastic thing. Life felt great. Germany went through a impressive and serious and substantial set of reforms that people in this audience know much better than I, that made Germany a much more competitive economy than it had been before. It seems remarkable today, but it was within the last 15 years that Germany was referred to as the sick man of Europe. And it went through this splendid set of reforms. So now think about what happened. Germany has become hyper competitive. The periphery has become hyper eager to spend and able to attract money. Germany, on a large scale, exported to the periphery, and of necessity, in order to export on a large scale to the periphery, Germany and other parts of the European core lent large amounts of money to the periphery. Well, there's a basic business rule. There's a basic rule if you're kind of a business, which is it's usually better if most of your sales are coming from people you're lending money to. That should make you nervous. And it should have made people nervous between 2001 and 2010, but it didn't. I think it's fair to say that if you'd done a retrospective on the euro coming up to the end of its first decade, around the time of 2007, before the early 2008, before the financial crisis had hit, I think you would have said the naysayers were wrong. The euro was off to a strong start. And certainly any number of European officials delivered triumphant speeches to that effect. What happened then? Then a financial crisis started in the United States. It started as a consequence of a range of financial excesses in the United States. It transpired that some of the most toxic of the toxic securities that carried a bit of a yield spread had been marketed successfully on a very large scale to very large European financial institutions that found themselves in much less satisfactory positions than they had supposed, which in turn affected their ability to lend, which in turn affected the health of the European economy. So there was transmission from the American financial crisis. And the other thing that happened was the realization, a little bit like, to use the realization that nothing in Greece was as it seemed. That the accounting was not a little bit wrong. It was very wrong and had been wrong for rather a long time, which then prompted the observation, like the 13th chime of a clock, that all might not be completely well in other places as well, leading to substantial contagion to other parts of Europe. All in all, to this point, the story bears out one of the aphorisms I learned in graduate school. Things in economics take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And thus it was with Europe's descent in 2010. Daniel Ellsberg wrote a famous essay on that. Daniel Ellsberg was for the younger members of the audience, Daniel Ellsberg was the author and then the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, the 6,000 page archive describing the history of the highly unfortunate U.S. experience in Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsberg wrote an essay on the history on the lessons of that 6,000 page history. And the essay was called The Stalemate Myth and the Quagmire Machine. And its point was that at every important juncture during the Vietnam War, top policymakers were presented with three choices. We could do nothing, in which case South Vietnam would capitulate or surrender. We could do A, B, C, D, and E, which were complicated, expensive, and painful in political terms, send more troops, in which case there were no guarantees, but there was the prospect of winning the war. Or we could do strategy C, strategy 3, which was A and part of B, in which case surrender could be avoided for the next 6 months, but there was no credible vision of an end game and no credible vision of victory. You probably know where this is going. At every point, Ellsberg demonstrated policymakers chose strategy C. And eventually, their strategy collapsed around them. In many ways, the story of Europe's response to the financial crisis has been along the lines of Ellsberg's essay. It's all going to be okay. Well, I guess it's not okay. We need to lend money. But there's absolutely not going to be any debt relief. Well, there's really no way to lend money credibly without debt relief. There will be debt relief for Greece. Well, but there's limits on what we can do. Well, we'll do whatever it takes, Mario Draghi famously observed. If you trace the history of the crisis, you will find that never was there a major step taken when collapse and disaster was more than a month away. And that every time collapse and disaster was a month away, what was done was pretty much the minimal step necessary to avoid collapse and disaster. And that is what has happened essentially to this point, with the most recent step being Mario Draghi's very welcome and quite bold decision to use the authority of the central bank to purchase large quantities of sovereign debt, and the eventual decision to signal that somehow central finances would be used to assure against the failure of financial institutions, major financial institutions in any member state. How would one evaluate this strategy? It depends on the aspiration. It is no small thing that doubts about the permanence of the euro area have largely been quelled. Educated opinion in the global financial community 2 or 3 years ago would have held that there was a substantial probability of some form of collapse of the euro area. That is not absolutely precluded, but is seen as extraordinarily unlikely today. There is no longer, in the way there once was, the prospect of large-scale bank runs in major European countries. This, too, is not a small thing. But it is important to recognize that European output, European consumer spending as a measure of living standards, is 15% below where any forecast made just a half dozen years ago would have said that it would be today. The international organizations will soon come with an estimate of the European economy's capacity for growth, and they will estimate that it is below, I believe, will estimate that it is below 1% a year, a rate at which progress is not highly meaningful, even over periods of a decade. And so the challenge before Europe is how to manage this monetary area in a way that generates substantially increased growth. And I might just say that this is not only Europe's challenge, it is a challenge for the world economy, because a weak Europe transmits its weakness. It transmits its weakness because a weak Europe means a weak euro. A weak euro means more competitive European exports, and more competitive European exports inevitably displace production that would take place in other places, notably in the United States and Japan. And so there is not just a European interest in the successful acceleration of growth, but there is also a broader global interest in that growth. It is true that Europe looks better today than it did around the turn of the year. A variety of indicators have turned up. But I would suggest to you that almost all of that progress can be accounted for by the fact that oil costs less today than it did months ago, or more accurately, that the benefits of lower priced oil have flowed through European economies, and that a weaker euro has conferred a variety of benefits. It would, in my judgment, be a great mistake to confuse a one-off increase in the level of output associated with the decline in the price of oil and a decline in the exchange rate with the achievement of ongoing growth at a reasonable rate. What is to be done? I would suggest 4 imperatives going forward. First, there is, in my judgment, a vast disproportion between any possible risk of inflation and the risk of a deflationary cycle breaking out in Europe. It follows that the risk that monetary policy is too tight are far greater than the risks that monetary policy is too weak. Again and again and again, Japan in the decade of the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s showed itself overconfident in declaring that recovery was at hand and moving to resume more normal monetary conditions, only to have to revert back with less confidence than there was before. Strong and universal support for the ECB doing what is necessary to achieve with confidence an ongoing inflation rate of its 2% target seems to me essential if Europe is to maximize its prospects for restoring substantial growth. Second, there is a compelling case for expanded public investment in many parts of Europe. To be sure, if one travels in Europe, one observes infrastructure of very different quality in different places. And certainly as an American, I am in no position to lecture about the quality of infrastructure. When I speak with American audiences on these matters, I always inquire whether anyone is, as an American, proud of Kennedy Airport as the gateway to our largest and greatest city, and I have not yet met an American who is proud of Kennedy Airport. But there is, it seems to me, a compelling case that is at least a threefer for expanded infrastructure investment. Expanded infrastructure investment represents demand at a time when economies are short on demand and offers the prospect of putting people back to work. Expanded infrastructure investment expands the ultimate capacity of economies to produce, giving rise to a sense of more progress over time and serving to enhance confidence. And increased infrastructure investment removes burdens from our children. My children are burdened just as surely if my generation defers maintenance as my children are burdened if my generation issues debt. And I am no construction expert, but I am here to tell you that when you defer maintenance, the costs rise a lot more rapidly than the 50 basis points a year at which Germany can now borrow. And so it is not just short-termism, but it is long-termism in the nature of protecting our children's interests that calls for increased infrastructure investment wherever it can be afforded. More generally, it was a remarkable thing when the IMF, hardly a bunch of flaky Keynesians, when the IMF, in its World Economic Outlook 6 months ago, declared that appropriate public investments pay for themselves in the sense that if you undertake them, your debt to GDP ratio is lower after 5 years than it would be if you had not undertaken them. There is a compelling case for expanded public investment. Third, there is a clear case, in my judgment, for proper structural reforms. Now, I think there is a tendency for structural reforms. Structural reforms in Europe are a little bit like education in the United States. If you don't know what you're for improved education. If you don't know what you're for and you don't like the alternative, we need structural policies, sound structural policies, and all will be okay. I think it's a mistake to exaggerate their impact. Remember, we said earlier that the single market was the greatest structural reform there'll ever be in Europe, and we've had it, and potential GDP growth is 0.9% a year. So it's a mistake to overstate the potential impact of structural reform. Nonetheless, there are many, many barriers to private investment and to private spending and to business formation that can sensibly be removed in many different countries. And their removal would contribute to increased confidence and increased spending. And it is a mistake not to do that. Now, I want to be clear. The kinds of structural reforms that will be availing are those that expand the potential of the global economy as a whole, not those that serve primarily to advance the competitive advantage situation of one country vis-a-vis another. As beneficial as the German reforms of the early part of the last decade were for Germany, they are not a viable template for all others. Their principal contribution to the German economy came from making Germany more competitive, leading Germany to a larger trade surplus. Economists disagree about everything, but there's actually one thing they do not disagree about, and that is that the sum of all the world's trade surpluses, some of which are obviously negative because they're trade deficits, have to add up to zero, since there is no trade with the moon. It follows that policies that succeed in spurring growth by creating trade surpluses represent shifts from one country to another in economic growth rather than a total advancement of economic growth. And so those measures which are investment promoting, yes. Those measures which are labor cost suppressing, no. They do not advance the interests of the global economy. Those measures which are promoting of total spending, yes. Those measures which are expenditure shifting from one country's goods to another, no. Appropriate structural reform, this too can make a substantial difference. Finally, I do not believe that it is viable for satisfactory growth in Europe to be restored on terms that are reasonable from the point of view of the entire global economy, as long as Germany is running as large a trade surplus with the rest of Europe as it currently is. What is to be done about that is really a matter for Europeans to address rather than for an outsider to address. But one cannot help but note that there is room for further wage increases in Germany, the result of which would be increased living standards, increased spending, increased importing, and a less extreme trade position. One could observe that a country that is able to borrow money for a decade at an interest rate of 50 basis points can probably be serene and comfortable in its own creditworthiness and is in a position to borrow and spend more on the interests of its citizens. Germany doing its part as others do. If others can't run as large trade deficits as they used to, because nobody wants to keep lending them money, Germany can't run as large trade surpluses as it historically has. Structural reforms, public investment, continued monetary support. This program offers the prospect, along with the continued institutional evolution of the euro area, of realizing its original promise. And make no mistake, the successful instantiation of the euro is an execution of an extraordinarily positive vision, an extraordinarily positive vision in which Germany has played a crucial role, of a true European community. A community that can, through its deeds and example, be an immensely powerful spur to progress in the rest of the world. And so when I, as an American, look to European Monetary Union and its evolution, I see severe challenges, yes. I see that those challenges can be sufficiently severe that the full technological potential of this moment may not be realized. But I also see, with the kind of determination and diplomacy that Europe has displayed often in the past decades, that the next years can be great years for European Union and for its contribution to my country and its contribution to the world. Thank you very much. I would be, as per Christine's instructions, I would be happy to happy to respond to some questions, and since I did not hesitate to be provocative, nor should anybody else. Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, I come from Spain. Thank you very much. I love your resume, and I think it's very fair to say that most of it fit into the picture, at least I have. I have two very, very specific questions. First of all, structural reforms. You mentioned you don't think that it's a zero-sum game, and this is not the way we should do if we want to take an advantage, a competitive advantage. But would it be fair to say, and I mentioned my country, that to go into the direction of the labor regulatory market as you have in the US would be fair to go into that direction? To have the sort of public spending that you have in the US would be fair to say that it's a right reform in my country? Or would you consider that we have to take it for granted, that we have to stop and just leave things as they are? So just we want to be like the US. Let's put it this way. The second question is about moral hazard. You know, moral hazard is something which is very popular in some countries, and we all share our love for morality, but sometimes with economics it's a little bit tricky. I mean, you were describing, and I think rightly, the way that the borrowing side and the lending side worked at the beginning of the Eurozone. Would you consider the moral hazard has two sides, not only the borrowing side, but also the lending side? But could you comment on that?
So I'm basically with you on the labor market stuff to a point. You know, one thing you kind of observe is, suppose you made a rule, suppose a country had a policy which was hotels were allowed to stop you from checking out. And the idea was that because hotels were allowed to stop you from checking out, then they'd have higher occupancy. It kind of wouldn't work that way, really, because not many people would check in if you weren't allowed to check out. And when you say that employment is for life, it sort of has that character. I mean, you know, the other example is, you know, how many dates would you go on if you had to be willing to marry anyone you went on a date with? Is another version of the same thing. So I think it's pretty clear that the extent to which the employment relationship is mandated to be forever is substantially excessive in many parts of Europe, including in your country. And as someone who was the president of a university that had a lot of tenured professors, I am particularly aware of some of the toxic aspects of excessive job security. So I relate. Here's a caution. Here's a caution, and it's probably the most. When I discovered what I'm about to tell you, it ran quite different to my instincts. I don't know the number for Spain, I'm sorry to say. But if we take France, which is not generally regarded as a paragon of flexibility, and we ask, take the group 25 to 54-year-old men. I choose that group not because it's the most important group, but because it's kind of a group where there's a universal social expectation of working. You know, in other ages, you might have retired early, you might be home with your woman, you might be home with your kids. 25 to 54-year-old men, we kind of have a general expectation in our societies that you're working. In America right now, 15% of the men in that group are not working. That's really a lot if you think about it. 15%. In 1965 in America, only 5% of that group was not working. So there's been a real withdrawal from work, and it's a troubling phenomenon. In France, with all its problems, with all its legendary inflexibility, with all its stuff, it's only about 12% of that group that is not working. So it's a mistake to think that we in the United States have been quite as spectacularly successful with our flexible labor market as many people suggest that we've been. Some of what happens is everybody looks at unemployment rates, and since in France you can sort of get unemployment benefits forever. Nobody says they're not unemployed. Nobody says they're out of the labor force. They say they're unemployed. Whereas in America, where you can't get unemployment benefits forever, you don't say you're unemployed. You say you're out of the labor force. But what we really care about is how many people are working. And the United States isn't doing quite as well on that as people tend to think. On moral hazard, there's sort of moral hazard in every direction. I think it's kind of the way of the financial world that lenders are supposed to protect themselves from borrowers. And lenders are supposed to underwrite their loans and check the creditworthiness of their loans. So I do not have much sympathy for borrowers who say, it's your fault you lent me the money. That seems to me, if the borrower is 12 years old, that's different. But in normal circumstances, I think the arguments of the form, the lender shouldn't have lent me the money, are not extraordinarily reasonable kinds of arguments for borrowers to make when they get in trouble. Yes.
Thank you for those very sensible recommendations, Dr. Summers. Your program is eminently sensible. I think a lot of us would agree with that here. What we can't understand is why Wolfgang Schäuble doesn't agree. And what I'm wondering is it time for the United States, for you personally and others, to make kind of a full-court diplomatic press to see if it's possible to get people in the Chancellor's office and in particular Wolfgang Schäuble's office to understand the simple arithmetic that you set out? I have a second question too, but can I give you the second one now, or would you prefer?
Sure, go ahead. One of the great things about people asking two-part questions is you can always choose the one you like better.
Yeah.
Better to answer, and so I'm eagerly awaiting your second one.
You wanted to be provoked. I'll see what
Sure.
I can do with the second one as well. The second one is Adair Turner, who you probably know Adair Turner, has come up with an interesting idea, which he's essentially saying the private sector and the public sector both want to deleverage at the same time, and the arithmetic consequence is deflation or depression if that happens. So he's saying we need a source of debt-free money to sluice into the economy to do exactly what you suggested, infrastructure investment and so on. And so why don't we essentially have the European Investment Bank buy zero-interest, indefinite-term bonds from the EIB, which could be puttable bonds, so that the ECB could require them to be repaid or not, depending on monetary and economic conditions in the future. So an interesting proposal that doesn't involve adding actually to the nominal debt of any European countries, and therefore it could sort of sidestep Wolfgang Schäuble's obsession with the balanced budget. Does that make sense? Does Adair Turner's suggestion make sense to you as well?
I don't understand. I don't understand the financial engineering of Adair's suggestion well enough to make a comment. As a general matter, I think that usually it's better to go at things in simple and straightforward ways, and I tend to be skeptical when people suggest some complicated financial engineering is the solution to a problem. But in fairness, I haven't studied Adair's strategy. I've spent time with Minister Schäuble, and I'll let him speak for his own views, and it's probably clear from what I have said that there are questions regarding the importance of demand and questions regarding the role of fiscal policy and questions regarding Germany's role, where I don't see things in the same way that he does. I have been struck in a way that I did not expect when I first started spending time with him by the extent of his commitment to the European integration project, which is as deep and profound as almost anyone's that I've observed. I've been struck by his concern for the welfare of ordinary citizens, and I came from the G7 meeting. G7 meeting's been meeting forever. He was the first one to invite a group of economics professors, many of whom, like me, were quite far from his convictions, to come and interact freely and with no hesitation to being aggressive with the group of ministers under his sponsorship. And so while I don't agree with him completely, I would not be inclined to a strategy of full court diplomatic press as the way to address him. I think a strategy of advancing the arguments and marshaling the evidence and is likely to be a much more effective strategy. And I think it's a mistake to overestimate the efficacy of full court diplomatic presses. Ultimately, in international life, it tends to be leverage that matters. And I'm not sure what, if anything, the United States is in a position to offer or threaten with respect to these issues. And it has not been the usual European view that the failures of American policy have taken the form of excessive reticence. And I would be cautious about the suggestion that the United States should take a far more aggressive role. Yes.
I'm still a bit puzzled about your analysis. I'm a bit puzzled.
Puzzled is a polite way of saying deeply skeptical of.
I basically share your analysis, but I have problems with your conclusions because when you go to the point, to the final point of your analysis, you have to say that this euro is a failure because it is the basic was it was a political project, and it has a political idea behind it, and it is. To start with, the political result is that it was supposed to unite Europe. The result is that it has created disparities among Europeans. The Germans have become the bad guy in most of these southern European countries, which was not the case in before the euro. If you are a German and you want to buy a house in Greece today, you have to be, it's a different way of negotiations than 10 years ago, where Germans were welcome. It is a political project which has failed because the institutions which were necessary for a successful monetary union were not politically accepted. It means fiscal unit, it means central bank, but not in the way the ECB is working. And this is, it would require European economic policy, which you made some recommendations. Germany should spend more, should invest in infrastructure. Greece or Italy should reform their public sector. But this is not what the voters in Europe will accept. They will not accept getting any recommendations from Brussels or from any other institutions. It's a democracy, so it's their voters who make the right or the wrong decisions for their own country. And this is a principle which we have to accept in Europe. And we have to accept that even if Europe is a failure, it's that their voters have decided so. When you look at, you mentioned the German trade surplus. Well, I mean, you know, as an economist, that the natural way to reduce this is to increase the price of your currency. Germany is profiting from, is taking advantage of a 30% undervalued currency at the moment. That's the reason why their exports are so high. And if we had not, we had a flexible currency system, the Deutsche Mark would be 30% higher, so the exports would be lower. Germany would invest more in the countries that you would like to, etc., etc. So
I think I get the drift.
Okay. The point is, on the one hand, you say,
I'm not sure how to respond. You know, one kind of response would be to say there are probably many people who, in their heart of hearts, if they looked back, they might have married a different person. But given that they've raised a family with the person they did marry, they regard divorce as unthinkable. And one can go back and one can try to construct a counterfactual history of what life would have been like without the Euro project, and one can argue about what would have happened. I think we see all the flaws of the project that we observed. We don't see the enormous tension that would have arose from the 10% depreciation of the French franc in 2004, or the dastardly Spanish effort to devalue its currency in 2007, or the agonizing tensions that the Bundesbank faced when it was marched on by German manufacturers, when its tight policies led to the appreciation of the German mark in 2009 after the financial crisis. So I think I was pretty clear in describing a set of concerns that I had at the time for the European Monetary Union. And I think there's no question that looking back, it was in some sense under-institutionalized. But I think there is a question. I think there's a set of questions about what was actually the alternative at the time. John Kornblum is no doubt thinking to himself, it wasn't like Germany's idea to do this. It was Germany did this in the context of a moment. We don't imagine today the world finding it unthinkable that Germany would again be reunified less than a half century after the Second World War. We just take it for given that Germany is one country. But that was not the view if you were a French 70-year-old who had fought in the Second World War. And it's kind of understandable that it wasn't the view. And the formation of the euro was part of the set of compromises that brought comfort for German unification. So I find it, I'm not sure you're wrong, but I don't find it as obvious as you do. I think this is one of those things where we will know more 15 or 20 years from now. If 15 years from now, Germany is the deeply resented paymaster of Europe, it will be hard to look back on this historic episode and say that this was all a success. If, in the fullness of time, adjustment takes place, Ireland proves to be a relatively typical example of the countries that received IMF programs, then I think it is at least plausible that this project will all be viewed in a much more benign way. In any event, I don't think right now, at a moment when Spain and Portugal can borrow money at rates well below the rates at which the United States of America can borrow money, I don't think turning back, and Italy too, I don't think turning back is a conceivable and live option. And therefore, what one has to think about is what are the policy approaches that offer the best prospect going forward. And that's what I've tried to do. Yes?
Thank you, Professor Summers, for this great talk. My name is Vincent Dreyer. I'm a PhD student from the FU Berlin. And I must say I take quite an opposite view of the one speaking before me. And yes, there are considerations of security, of the economy, and all that. But I must say, I actually believe in the euro. I also believe in Europe. But more and more, I grow quite clueless or even afraid what's coming or what's happening. And I know you don't want to lecture our political elites, but you have met them in the 90s, late 90s, late 2000s. What can we do? What can I, as a young person, actually do to convince them to actually make like 3 steps at a time and not this incremental step by step by step. And as you said, you drew the parallel to the Vietnam War. I mean, we don't want that outcome in the end, right? But so what can we do? Thank you.
He's suggesting a full court diplomatic.
Suggesting?
He's suggesting a full court diplomatic press, I think. I'm paraphrasing.
Look, I think I think you make I think that I guess one of the things I've sort of learned in my limited involvements in political life is that the transition from inconceivable to inevitable can sometimes be quite rapid. That those of us who are pushing ideas and arguments, part of what we're doing is we're creating a reserve and a reservoir for the moment when something changes in the context that causes people to be looking for different kinds of approaches than they were pursuing before. And so I think you just have to kind of marshal the evidence and make the arguments. And I guess the other thing I've learned is, and certainly that I've learned relative to when I was your age, is when I was your age, I tended to think that when I encountered people who had radically different views than I had, I tended to think that what I really had to figure out next was, were they stupid or were they evil? Because those were really the two possibilities, because otherwise they'd have my view. And I certainly haven't, we're all works in progress, me too. But I think I've come to the view that people probably have their views because of some combination of experiences they've had and pressures that they feel. And that if you get a better understanding of the experiences they had and the pressures that they feel, you are more likely to be successful in being persuasive to them. And so I think part of the answer, which I'm not really able to do coming from the outside, is I think trying to get a better understanding of what lies behind the gestalt that leads to more German enthusiasm for austerity than you and I have, and trying to address it within the context of that gestalt, I think is probably the way in which one can make the greatest contribution to being persuasive. Last question. In back.
Detlef Sprins, University of Potsdam. Thank you for your eloquent speech. The French Revolution invented civil divorce, and it made it law. Assume in a currency union you have family members who are at difficulty in governing themselves, especially in the financial sense, and you were presented with 3 options: exit active, or B, exit passive, or C, none of the above. You know what I mean.
I'm sorry,
You exit either actively or you're thrown out, like out of the family, happens. Or the third is none of the above options, especially option C, none of the above. If you choose that, please provide a reasonable argument in its support. Thank you.
I'm not sure I follow the question, but I'm gonna take it as I'm gonna interpret the question as being that was all well and good, but the exciting issue right now is Greece, and you avoided it, and I'm not gonna let you get to the cocktail hour without telling us what you think about Greece. Look. Everybody's narrative has elements of truth in it with respect to Greece. Those who think that others should not be called on to finance social protections in a much poorer country that are more generous than the social protections in their rich country have a good point. Those who think that that the Greeks have a not very good record in meeting their commitments are right. Those who think that Greece's representations as to even the past have not been consistently accurate, they're right too. Those who think that it's a very complicated political environment in Greece in which any Greek government is going to have difficulty getting things done, and the provision of finance is difficult, is therefore can't be relied on to succeed. They've got a good point too. On the other hand, those who look and who say we've had a worse GDP decline than anybody else by far, we have imposed far more austerity on ourselves, and there's been far more austerity imposed on us than on anyone else. Those who say, you say you've been incredibly generous to us, West, but actually most of the money has gone in, and then it's gone right back out to pay your banks. And so really not that much of your money has stayed in our country so far, and that your projections of what we could achieve served to limit the amount of debt you had to relieve and to limit the amount of money you had to contribute, but they weren't really hugely realistic. They have a point as well. And so I don't think anybody's got any monopoly on virtue or morality or right here. Here's what I do think. I think that if Greece leaves, it's unlikely to be good for anyone. I think that the degree of instability in the Greek economic and financial environment outside the framework of the euro area will be much greater than the instability inside the euro area. I think that the same problems of administrative capacity that limit Greece's ability to carry out economic reforms will limit its ability even more to execute policy in a capital-controlled, parallel currency kind of environment. I think a Greece that is relatively free of the euro and that is at least separated, if not divorced, from the euro area on Europe's southern flank is not without its very important security implications. And I think that I know that no one, not the smartest people, thought that the failure of a $4.5 billion hedge fund called LTCM would bring the world's financial system into peril. I know that Ben Bernanke's a very sage observer of these things, and he didn't think subprime was really all that important relative to the global capital market. I know that many people thought that a lesson had been taught at Bear Stearns, and so Lehman could be allowed to fail without consequence. And so when people tell me that if there's an exit by Greece, that it'll be okay. We've got contagion managed. I hear all those voices. The people who think the contagion might be managed, they may be right. I actually think there's probably a better than 50% chance that they're right. But there's some experiments you just do not want to run. And this seems to me to be one of those experiments. And so my hope is that Greece can find the tangible steps that will signal its recognition that it needs to make a set of adjustments that will put it on a more sustainable path if it wishes to enjoy the continued support of the international community, and that Greece will find a way to make a set and begin acting on a set of policy commitments that will send that signal, and that the international community will recognize that, yes, there is no progress without the numbers adding up, that you cannot run an economic program on the premise that 2 + 2 = 7, but will also recognize that in a nation of millions of people, most of whom are without sin with respect to these problems, you cannot operate only on the basis of green eye shade values, and that a context has to be provided that offers the prospect for real and meaningful economic progress. And in that regard, and if there is any silver lining in the situation, it is that the very depths to which Greece has fallen provide more room than there is in most situations for some spring forward and some growth. And so it is very much my hope that common ground will be found between Greece and the European and the international community in what are now the weeks ahead, because I believe that while nothing here is likely to look hugely attractive from many perspectives, that the path forward with unity is substantially more promising for both Greece and for Europe than the path forward apart, but that will require a willingness to compromise relative to one's most preferred position, both on the part of Europe and on the part of Greece. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you tonight.